Good afternoon. My name is Ben Williams. I'm a consultant. I work for NCC Group, and most of what I do is penetration testing. So from my day-to-day role is basically assessing our customers' external and internal infrastructure and web applications and trying to break in. In my spare time, I do a little bit of exploit development. I like to play around with security products. I spoke here last year. I don't know if any of you here saw my talk last year on attacking security gateways via web UIs. Anyone? It was on at the same time of Dave Litchfield's talk on databases. But he's better looking than I am, so some of you may not have seen that. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities I've discovered over the period of sort of 2012. So last year I talked about some research I'd done in 2011 where I'd looked specifically at security gateway products. And I looked at some software products and some appliances and focused on the web UI. And following on from that research, in 2012 I focused more on security appliances because I saw that there were more vulnerabilities and more serious vulnerabilities in the security appliances, and they were easier to find and exploit. Predominantly because of the large interaction between the web UI and the underlying operating system in appliances. So what are you going to see today? Well, I'm going to show some of the exploits that I've found. So there's going to be a little bit of demo. You're going to get to see a little bit of root shell. What you're not going to see, you're not going to see any rocket science, because some of the vulnerabilities that I've discovered are fairly basic OWASP top 10 type issues, basic misconfiguration type issues. Which kind of brings us on to the irony that it's interesting that so many of our security products suffer from such relatively basic and easy to find vulnerabilities. I've seen plenty of irony over the last 18 months or so. For example, web application firewall with web application vulnerabilities, firewalls that you can attack and compromise fully from outside of an organization, email filters that you could compromise with a malicious email, a URL filter that you could compromise with a malicious URL, and a single sign-on system where you could extract all of the credentials out of the system in an unauthenticated way. So there's certainly lots of irony there, and when myself or my colleagues see some of these things, we sometimes give a little pen tester chuckle, but it's not really loud funny when you appreciate that these products are widely deployed and used by lots of companies, and the companies that are using these products might not be aware that such issues exist. So what's my basic proposition? I think there's a temptation for us, even within the security community, to think of appliances as somehow hardened and secured, that they've undergone comprehensive security testing and can be trusted. Now, personally, based on some of the research I've done, I've got my own definition of a security appliance, and it's that it's a poorly configured Linux system, which is out of date with old packages, and an insecure web application, and other applications as well. So what kinds of appliances am I going to be talking about today? So I've looked at various different types of appliances, mainly security appliances, some appliances which are not related to security, but the kind of thing that I tend to look at are things like email, web filtering products, firewalls, gateways, UTMs, remote access systems, that kind of stuff. But I've also looked at some, as I said, non-security type appliances. I'm going to show some examples today. We're going to look at the Symantec, Trend, and Sophos email gateways, the Citrix remote access gateway, and maybe one other if we have a little bit of time at the end. So are these products trusted? Well, if we look at the Secure Computing Magazine 2013 Reader Trust Awards, there are lots of different categories in the awards that Secure Computing do. But just looking at the email section, as we're going to look at some of those products today. So I've looked at 3 of those products and found serious issues in 4 of them. And you might say, well, how's that? Well, when I looked at the McAfee product, I looked at the Gateway product, and when they fixed the issues, it also affected, they had to fix the email product as well. Also, when I looked at the Barracuda email gateway, found some issues which affected their whole range of products. So because some of these products have common frameworks across a whole product set, when you find vulnerabilities in one product, that can affect multiple products from the same vendor. So how are they deployed? Well, obviously, some of these systems, as you can appreciate, are high value to an attacker, such as the firewall, email filtering products, and internal security applications as well. Now, if you get these products compromised, an attacker can potentially gain lots of confidential information. But where they sit within the network greatly affects how they can be attacked. One of the interesting things I found about some of the firewalls, multifunction gateways, systems which sit at the perimeter, is that by default, a lot of them have the management interface, and sometimes SSH as well, enabled on all network interfaces. So by default, the web UI is exposed to the internet unless the administrator has gone in and turned that off. It's something we quite often come across as in pen tests. We'll find some management interface for a router or firewall exposed to the internet, and definitely recommend customers to check for that and turn it off. Also, for things like email filters, web filters, which sit in the DMZ, these typically won't have the management interface exposed to the internet unless the administrator's made a mistake, because you should have some filtering there. But if you can Google dork these devices and find UIs. But even where the management interface is not exposed to the internet, sometimes they have interfaces which are designed to be exposed to the internet, such as SSL VPNs, user portals for spam management so that users can go in and release messages that aren't spam, that kind of thing. And also, when the UIs are not exposed to the internet at all, they can be attacked by reflective cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery by external attackers. And I'll show some examples of that. So let's have a look at a first example. This was a product which came up for me in a pen test back in September. So this is a Sophos email gateway. And I didn't know this product was going to come up in advance. I was given a range of IPs to look at. And I scan it with Mmap and find some interesting things. So I've got a system which has got SSH on port 24, a little bit unusual, it's usually port 22. The other unusual thing about SSH on this device was that it was private key authentication only. So normally with appliances, it tends to be username and password, and there's quite often default creds, and it's quite trivial sometimes to do brute force attacks. And if the administrator's chosen a weak password, then there's potential for compromise there. I can see it's also got port 25 open, so it's some kind of email filtering product. And then when I look at the UIs, I can see it's a Sophos email gateway. And at that point, I turned to my colleague, I kind of rubbed my hands, and I said, this is going to be a fun test. I'm going to break into this product, and then we'll probably find some ODE as well. And he, knowing me, said, well, yeah, you carry on with that, and I'll look at some of the other hosts on the network. So let's have a look at this product. It's got 2 UIs. So I mentioned some of these products have 2 UIs. So it's got a user portal, which typically these user portals authenticate against Active Directory using LDAP. And then it's got this administrative UI. So one of the things I mentioned last year is that some of these products are really trivial to brute force. I said it was too trivial to show, but I want to show it here just so that you can get an idea of how easy it can be. So here I'm just using burp intruder to just do a brute force attack against the admin UI, and I'll explain a little bit in a bit why it's so trivial. So we're just looking for differences in responses here. I've set up burp to use maximum threads, 127 threads. And it's quite a simple authentication here. This one's just a JSON request and response. This is just a post request. And a little tip that I tend to do with these attacks is I tend to strip down the post request. Just a little thing I tend to do, strip out any unnecessary headers and any unnecessary parameters, just to cut down the amount of data that my brute force tool has to process. So we're just going to kick off a quick brute force attack here. When I say brute force, if you're doing brute force, you're doing it wrong. I would say what I'm doing here is a focused password attack. And in this example, I've just set up a list of 500 passwords. I've got the right password in there, so it's a little bit contrived. But you can see that's 500 passwords, and that's gone through in under 20 seconds. So if you multiply that up, you're basically talking about 100,000 an hour, 500,000 a day. You know, it depends how long I've got and how keen I am to get into this product. But basically, I found the right password, and I can log in. So, as I said, it's trivial, it's not an exploit. I wouldn't categorize it as an exploit, but in a practical sense, in this pen test, I gained access to this product in about 30 minutes, just to give you an idea. It's not always that easy, but it's easy for multiple reasons. In these products, you tend to have a default user account, which often you can't change. You've got a scalable platform, so it's a Linux system with a scalable web server such as Apache, Nginx, or Tomcat, so it will handle lots of concurrent threads and it will be very responsive. You tend to have no account lockout, no brute force protection, and minimal password complexity. So for example, in this Sophos product, it required 4 characters of complexity. It's the same in the Trend product that we're going to look at a little bit later on. And it varies, so some products it'll be 8 and some products none at all. Administrators are users, same as anyone else, and they'll choose passwords which other administrators tend to choose. So to give you an example, on my laptop I've got a password list of 20 million passwords, which has come from various hacked services over the years. I tend to squirrel away password lists and kind of sort them by priority. Now in this kind of test I wouldn't use the whole 20 million. I might use it for a first pass for hash cracking. But in an online attack, I'll just head off maybe 50,000 or 500,000, depending on how long I want to spend. A few of these devices have login alerting. If they do have login, it tends to be for SSH. And if they do have alerting, it tends to be for the web UI, but it's rare that administrators will get notified that an attack is in progress. So, having gained access to this system on the customer site, I could see the product had lots of issues. Cross-site scripting with session hijacking, easy cross-site request forgery, poor cookie security, poor password security, so there were some plain text passwords in the admin UI of end users if you chose not to authenticate against Active Directory. OS command injection, and at that point, I was like, okay, I'm probably not going to do the OS command injection because I don't want to brick my customer's live email appliance. So I kind of took it offline. I said to the customer, found some O-Day, effectively, with the Sophos product they're using, and I'll report that separately to Sophos. And they were fine with that because they had plenty of their own issues to deal with. So I went and got an evaluation. So just to give you a quick look, so I've got an ESX system at home. I run quite a few different virtual appliances on and do some of my development on. So this is running Spider in the site with Burp Scanner running. And how many of you do web app testing? Any hands? Okay, so if you do a web application that's online these days, you don't tend to see so many red blobs. So quite a lot of cross-site scripting there, 166 instances. So some of those were false positives and some were duplicates. But the reason there's quite so many is because there's some generic cross-site scripting there. But you can see also we've got trivial OS command injection that Burp's picking up itself just with backticks and a ping delay. Usually it's more difficult to find OS command injection than that, but not so much more difficult. So there's quite a lot of instances of issues here, but just to put this into context, this is not really unusual because most of these issues are quite common in the appliances that I've looked at. So let's talk a little bit about command injection. I'm particularly interested in command injection because my end goal when I'm looking at these products is to get a root shell. And there's several reasons for that. First, that if you can do a root shell via the web UI, you can sometimes do that reflectively via internal users and administrators as an external attacker using cross-site request forgery and cross-site scripting. So even when the external attacker can't see the web UI, you can still attack the product and get a shell, outbound, reverse shell, by abusing those kind of functions. The second thing is that administrators don't have full control over these devices. And by that I mean their use of the device is restricted. So if they use the device via the console or they SSH into the device, they'll end up in a restricted shell where they've got some kind of menu system which protects the integrity of the product by only enabling to do certain functions. And the same is true in the web UI. So for example, in anti-spam products, the administrator can see, he can manage policy and he can see messages which have been blocked as spam or are having problems being delivered or being processed. He can't just sit at his desk eating his lunch and look at the CEO's email. Yeah, there's confidentiality built into these products for good reason. But if you've got a root shell on the underlying operating system, you can see all the traffic that's going through the box. Third thing is, obviously, if we can root these boxes, especially as an external attacker, they can become a platform for attacking the rest of the internal network. So let's have a look at a little bit of root shell. So the first one we're going to look at is a little bit unrealistic. So imagine in this case, the administrator has left the web UI accessible to the internet and SSH, so we can access it directly. And in this product there was cross-site scripting with session hijacking, session fixation, and obviously you've got the brute force. There's a few different ways of gaining access to the web UI. So let's just look at this command injection point. So here I'm using burp again. So I did a little bit of enumeration in a kind of BlackHat way with this product to try and enumerate the operating system from within this injection point. And one of the things I noticed was that the web UI is running as a low privilege user, but that I could enumerate some of the operating system and I could see that low privilege user had its own SSH private key. So I could copy that across to the web root, download it, and then log into the box with that SSH private key. And you see here I get a full bash shell, not a restricted shell, and there are usually various privesks on these boxes so you can escalate to root. But then I thought, well, I'll try something dumb. I'll try and log in with that same SSH key as root and see what happens. And it's always worth trying something dumb because here it lets me log in with the same key as root. So one of the easier privesks I've found. So basically what I'm saying is that I did actually do an additional check to make sure this SSH key does get generated as part of the install, and it does. There's always a chance that you'll find a key which is common to multiple appliances, but it does get generated as part of the install, but it gets assigned to multiple users, and it's the same key. So kind of easy privesk there. So there we've got a root shell that way. So let's have a look at a more realistic type of attack. So here, imagine our external attacker hasn't got access to the web UI or SSH. So first thing he needs to do is enumerate what product is in use. And he can do that often by looking at things like a user portal. So if he finds a spam management user portal, that'll have the exact product version sometimes, unauthenticated. But probably more commonly, some of these products, every message they process, they mark it with the product name and the exact product version in an X header. So by sending emails to non-existent users and getting bounce messages, you can get the product version, but you can also often get the internal IP address of the machine, which are two of the three things you need in order to do these kind of reflective attacks. So the next thing we need to do is obviously get our administrator to view the attacker's website where he's crafted an attack. And cross-site request forgery, one of my favourite things, because we're actually getting the administrator to do the command injection for us, and then we'll get a reverse shell going back out of the company on port 25, because it's an SMTP appliance. It must be able to talk out on port 25 so that it can send email. So put together a proof of concept for this. What I've basically done here is taken that post request out of Burp, I've wrapped it up in some HTML, and I've also put some priv-asc in here as well, so that we end up getting a root shell. There was various issues on this device, but one of the things was you could overwrite some world writable scripts, which were pseudo scripts, so you could get command injection as root. So I've set that up as a self-submitting form, so a little bit of JavaScript there to submit the form, wrap that up in a hidden iframe so that the admin isn't going to see any responses, and then set up our netcat listener so we can catch the shell. And then this is our victim administrator. This product has a very long session timeout, so it gives you quite a big window. So if he closes the UI and then at some point later visits the attacker's site, we get our shell coming back in. And it's a root shell because of the privilege escalation that I put in line in the request. So we've got access to the underlying operating system there. So what do you get on these systems, on the underlying operating system? What you tend to see, old kernel, old packages, unnecessary packages, poor configurations, insecure proprietary applications. So I've talked to vendors at trade shows occasionally about their appliances, and one of the things that they tend to say, so I say, tell me a bit about your appliance. They tell me, oh, it's based on hardened Linux. And I would say, I definitely disagree with that, because I've not seen any appliance which I would consider to be hardened Linux. They very commonly have things like debuggers, compilers, scripting languages which don't need to be there, application managers such as yum and apt-get, network sniffers like TCP dump, and other tools. So I've seen things like nmap on a firewall, where it's not functionality which is used via the web UI or the restricted shell. So why does it even need to be there? I've not seen any SE Linux deployed in the security appliances I looked at. I've seen it once in a non-security appliance, but low privilege users could do things that root couldn't, and you could priv-asc to root and root could turn it off. So you could basically work around it. And you don't tend to get much in the way of integrity checking on the underlying operating system. So that looks like a nice place for an attacker to live. Nice cozy shell. Let's move in. In other words, we're just going to look at some post-exploitation. Again, looking at the Sophos appliance, I'm not picking on Sophos here because most of these things apply to, pretty much any appliance once you get a shell. So one of the things I thought might be fun to show is a little bit of command line foo. So basically, I've put together a command line one-liner, so the appliance has already got TCP dump on it, and we're going to run TCP dump on the appliance and exfiltrate SMTP traffic back to the attacker's machine and display it in Wireshark, which I thought was a nice one-liner. Probably, if you're a real attacker, you wouldn't do it this way. There'd be other ways of getting the email off the box, but I thought it might be nice to show it like this. So again, a little bit contrived, because at the same time as doing this, I'm sending emails through so that you can actually see something happening. And we're going to search through those emails for a bit of text. We've got some emails going through there. And I'm just going to search the packet bytes for the word password. Again, it's a little bit contrived, because none of us obviously send passwords in email, do we, anyway? And then you can see we've got an email from Sally to Bob, basically talking about a password for a router. So a little bit contrived, but you get the idea that basically that an attacker with a shell can see more than a normal admin can, because an admin wouldn't normally be able to access anyone's email that's going through the box. And this applies to other protocols as well. So for example, on this device you've got a user portal, which is SSL. So end users are authenticating against that, and their authentication is handled by Active Directory. But you can sniff that traffic, you can easily extract the private key for the self-signed certificate and decrypt the traffic. Actually sounds more complicated than it is, really easy to do it in Wireshark. And then you can get plain text passwords of internal users, which is obviously handy. Let's have a look at something a little bit more black hat. Oops. So this is kind of modifying an appliance. Now, because we've got a root shell, obviously we've got full control over the device. But there are certain things which makes it much easier to do things to. This device is actually not Linux, it's FreeBSD, but it's got the package manager installed. So to be in root basically means that it can do what you want to it, but having a package manager on there already, as you know, if you do a lot of Linux stuff, just makes life so much easier. So I'm just going to install mmap from a public repository here, and then start using that to enumerate the internal network. Now obviously you could do other things with this. You could turn it into a development environment, add in other tools on there to kind of play about with the device and find other vulnerabilities in the device. But yeah, just running mmap as an example. So you could use it as a base for attacking and enumerating the rest of the internal network effectively. So, reported this to SoFast back in October. The vendor was good to work with, easy to work with, responsive and helpful. They fixed this in January, and I think they just pushed up some additional information yesterday which described what the vulnerabilities were that they fixed. So that's all good. The ironic thing is that most of the security appliances I've looked at have these kinds of issues. This is a fairly typical situation. So let's talk a little bit about commonalities. Initially, when I was putting together these slides, I thought, well, maybe I could do some statistics on the vulnerabilities that I'm finding. But thinking about that more deeply, I don't think it's actually that helpful, because I'm cherry picking. I'm not reporting everything I find. So I'm not reporting things like issues with weak SSL, that kind of stuff, or best practice issues, low priority issues. So for example, a lot of these devices have self-signed certificates which are common to all installs. They support SSL v2, they have weak ciphers, that kind of stuff. So if we were doing a full product assessment, there'd be a lot of additional issues I could raise. I don't really care about any of that in my personal research, because all I'm trying to find is something which is going to gain me access to the web UI as the admin, or get me a shell on the box, or things which can help me to get to that point, such as being able to enumerate the exact version of the product in use as an external attacker. So I've kind of split this up into categories in terms of those goals. So the most common things that I've seen, which applies to most appliances, is easy password attacks. Almost all devices I looked at had cross-site scripting with session hijacking, which gets a bit boring after you've seen it 10 times, but why is it there in a security product? Sometimes with cross-site scripting you can do password theft, which is even better than session hijacking, because if you've got cross-site scripting and password autocomplete enabled in the same UI, you can steal the credentials out of the administrator's browser. Non-hardened Linux already talked about. Information disclosure already talked about. The majority of appliances also had cross-site request forgery of administrative functions. So by getting an administrator to click on a crafted link, you could get them to add a backdoor administrator or arbitrarily reconfigure the product in other ways. OS command injection and privilege escalation, either within the web UI. Sometimes you have multiple roles in the web UI, but more predominantly on the underlying operating system when you're going from a low priv shell to a high priv shell. Several of the products I looked at had stored out-of-band cross-site scripting, which I think is quite an interesting attack vector. We'll look at a couple of those a bit later. Direct authentication bypass, found a few times. Denial of service. So, for example, during 2012, I looked at some of the Barracuda appliances and realized that they were vulnerable to the August 2011 Apache byte range DOS issue, which is an attack against Apache. It's a known vulnerability. But it's quite a powerful attack because it doesn't just affect the web UI. It's very CPU intensive, so it basically freezes the whole box. So it's DOS, but it'd be very annoying because you'd have to have the administrator go and turn off the box and turn it back on to get it back up. And depending on what the box does, if it's an email processing appliance or some kind of firewall, that could affect a whole network as opposed to just a single system. SSH misconfiguration, found a few times, and wide variety of more obscure issues, like session fixation and session token prediction, that kind of stuff. But typically it tends to be OWASP top 10 type stuff and other misconfiguration issues. So let's have a look at another product. So this is a product that several of us looked at NCC. One of my colleagues found a breakout of the restricted shell so you could execute commands as root. Another one found command injection as root in the web UI. And I found this other issue. But sometimes, as I said, when we find these UIs in an external pen test, we say, okay, that's a gateway. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just go through that gateway? And then I could turn my rather dull external pen test into a more interesting internal pen test. Sometimes you can walk around the gateway because there's no fence, which is kind of appropriate in this case. Now, this was a bit of an odd one, so I want to explain what I thought as I was looking at this. In the end, I only spent about half a day looking at this product. And so one of the first things I like to do on these products is I look at virtual appliances. So I'll mount the disk on another operating system so I can have a poke about on the underlying operating system. And I also want to get a shell on there, so I'll try and SSH on. Now on this product, SSH is not enabled by default. So I enable SSH and SSH on, and then I log in, but when I'm logging in, I'm SSHing with my username, and then it's asking me again for my username. So I'm like, well, what's this? This is not SSH. And then when I start poking about on the OS, I look at the shadow file, and I'm looking for the password hashes to crack, because sometimes there are default creds on these boxes for hidden accounts, and for example, in the Symantec product we're going to look at a little bit later, in 2012 I found a undocumented user account of support with a password of Symantec. SSH was enabled by default, and you got a full bash shell, and there's privesc on the underlying operating system. That wasn't a deliberate backdoor, obviously it was a mistake, and when I reported to them they fixed it. And in fact, when I looked at previous versions of that product, that wasn't there, so it's something that had been introduced. But it's always worth looking for that sort of thing. But what I see here is, where's my password hashes I'm going to try and crack? And then I realise, well, what's happening here is two different authentications. You've got SSH for admin and no password, and then you've got a restricted shell where you put in the admin and password that you chose during the install wizard. But it's let me SSH to the box for admin and no password. And that SSH is more than just about shell, because you do other things. You can do port forwarding. Poking about on the internals of the appliance, I find that there's several internal ports, one of which is an unauthenticated version of the web UI. So for the price of admin and no password, you can tunnel that out and you get full administrative control over the device. So here's just to show you that. This is a normal admin UI, so it's HTTPS and you've got a login. I've had to obfuscate this because it's quite a recent vulnerability. But basically, you tunnel this port out You don't need to log into this restricted shell, and then you just go to this URL on your local host, and then bam, you've got access to the admin UI. As I said, one of my colleagues found command injection as root in this UI, so we know we could get a root shell on the box. But more interestingly than that, you could do other things. So SSH was not enabled by default, and in order to do this type of attack, you'd have to have SSH exposed to the internet. So caveats with this. But if those two things are true, then as an external attacker, you could scan the internal network and then tunnel out arbitrary ports and services from the internal systems and then attack them directly as if they were on the internet. So a little quick example of that. So in this example, I've set up a vulnerable Windows system which is vulnerable to MS-0867, which is like, if you've done any pen testing, you'll be really familiar with. Quite an old exploit now, but we still find it as part of pen tests. And that's basically on an internal non-routable network. So my 192 network is acting as my external network, and then I've got a 10 network which has got this internal vulnerable system. Then I've set up Metasploit to attack my local host on the ports that I've tunneled out. And there you can see the ports I've tunneled out from the internal system on the non-routable network. And then just attack that. So the vulnerability I'm using here is not really that relevant because, as we all know, networks tend to be crispy on the outside and soft in the middle. There tend to be lots of vulnerabilities on internal networks due to patch management issues, configuration management, that kind of stuff. But there we've got basically a root shell via the Citrix Access Gateway. So that's rather ironic, isn't it? We've got a secure remote access gateway that potentially can give external attackers remote access to the internal network, and an auth bypass and root shell in its web UI. So this was a really recent one. This was fixed last week. There is a CVE. I don't think there's anything actually in it yet, so it's quite fresh, that one. But some more details on the Citrix website there. So let's talk a little bit more about combination attacks, because I think this is, if there is anything innovative, this is combining attacks is where it is in these vulnerabilities. So last year I talked about a vulnerability that I found in Proofpoint's product, which is an email filtering product. And basically, to summarize, you could, as an external attacker, you could send in an email which has got spam in the body of the message and some JavaScript in the subject line to deliberately get the message quarantined as spam. And when the administrator or the end user checked the quarantine area, just a list of quarantined messages, the attacker's JavaScript would execute, and you could then do on-site request forgery to arbitrarily reconfigure the product. So in other words, you could own the product with a malicious email, and it's an email filtering product. Now, I thought that would be kind of rare. I've actually found it in other products since. I found some outbound cross-site scripting in a firewall product as well, where you could put some JavaScript in the username of an SSH authentication attempt. That would go into the security log, and the security log was rendered in the web UI. When the security administrator of the firewall checked the security log in the web UI, you could get a root shell, basically. So, kind of ironic. You might say that, well, security administrators don't check their security logs, but I'm sure you could social engineer that in some way. But I think particularly email out-of-band cross-site scripting is very exploitable because of the ease of distribution and the way you can chain it together with other attacks. So you can spam these emails out with a spam tool. The cross-site scripting, because it appears in the web UI with the rest of the web UI functionality, it can't be detected by the administrator's browser, and he's also just there doing his day job, so you don't have to social engineer him to get the attack payload to work. He's just reviewing the quarantine area or whatever. The other interesting vulnerability that I found that we're going to see combined with that is faulty backup and restore functions. So to describe this in brief, so several of these products have backup and restore functions, either for policy or for message areas, or sometimes I've seen this issue in things like patch management features or licensing features, where basically when you do a backup, it creates a tar gzip of a directory structure on the OS. And when you do a restore, it basically restores that from the top of the file system as root, without any integrity checking, or with very minimal integrity checking. So by taking a backup, adding some files, you can overwrite or add arbitrary files to the underlying operating system. Now, when I reported this to vendors, some of them decided not to fix it, because they assumed that by fixing the other issues, such as cross-site scripting or authentication bypass, or any issues which gave the attacker access to the web UI, at that point, now it's only valid administrators that can gain access to the web UI, so this doesn't matter. Well, I said, well, no, I think this still matters, because this can be abused by cross-site request forgery. And if there's anything innovative in this presentation, maybe this is it. So let me just show you this. So the way that the file upload features tend to work is typically it's a multi-part MIME post message. So all you need to do really is kind of spoof these messages. So here we've got a structure of the actual file upload message, and there tends to be multiple requests that need to be made in order to abuse this. So I put together some JavaScript here, which basically is going to make a couple of requests in this particular product. And it's using XML HTTP request. So there you can see the requests, and there's some more detail on this on the white paper. But you need to make two requests typically, one to upload the file and then a second to click OK. And sometimes you need to set that up in advance. Here we've basically got the blob of the data in JavaScript, which is going to be the file upload. And in most of the cases I looked at, that could be completely crafted in advance without anything from that particular appliance. In other words, there didn't need to be a valid config, there didn't need to be a valid backup to restore, just the attacking files and perhaps an index file. So this product is actually OpenFiler, which is not a security product, but as I put this video together already, I thought I'd show this. We'll look at it in a security product in a bit. But basically, here's the web UI with the administrator logged into it. This product happened to have very poor session management, because the way it did it was set the session tokens as the username and password. So it never actually had session timeout. So you've got a big window of opportunity. But when the victim administrator views the attacker's website, then we get this reverse shell coming back in. And it's a root shell because it's a high privilege function. The only way you can see actually what's going on is if you use an intercepting proxy. So here we can see the blob of data that's actually the file upload in that first request. And then the second request is saying confirm equals yes to click the button. And then if we look at the responses, we can see, are you sure you would like to restore the configuration archive? And in the second response, it will say file successfully uploaded. But obviously the administrator wouldn't see this. So you can only see this with an intercepting proxy. So that's basically how that type of attack works. So you get the administrator to view the attacker's website. He does this spoof file upload and clicks apply, and then you get a shell going back out to the attacker's system. So let's have a look at that, those two things combined in a security product. So we're going to look at the Symantec email gateway appliance. Now, I spent about 3 days looking at this product and another 3 days looking at the next product we're going to look at. So to give you an idea, it's quite quick to find some of these issues. So I'm not doing full product assessment. I'm just, as I said, cherry picking, looking for the most serious issues that I can find in the shortest space of time, effectively. To do a full product assessment of these types of products, you're probably talking about a small team of pen testers for a couple of weeks at least. But you can see I found in this product out-of-band cross-site scripting, and then you've got cross-site request forgery and the SSH issue I talked about already. But you've got the ability for an authenticated attacker to modify the web application, and that was as root. Yeah? So by combining these issues together, you can do cross-site scripting in an email subject line as the initial launch of the attack, and then use the faulty backup and restore feature via on-site request forgery to add some arbitrary function, a new function to the web UI, and a SUID binary, and then use the cross-site scripting to run that new function, which runs a SUID binary, which sends a shell back out to the attacker. So, quick video of that. So here I'm basically sending an email from the command line. It's basically got some JavaScript in the subject line, which is pulling in some additional JavaScript from the attacker system. It's quite difficult with the length you get with a subject line to put anything in there, which is really malicious. You usually have to pull in some additional stuff. So here we're setting up the listener on port 25 again. So this is the product, quite a nice product, quite easy to use. The vulnerable function in this product was in the audit logs. So the messages didn't have to actually be quarantined. They just had to have been processed. And if the attacker's email came up in the results of a search of the audit logs, the attack payload is running now. And I've put in a couple of pop-ups so that you can actually see something happening, because otherwise you wouldn't see anything as an administrator. So we should see a pop-up happening shortly. There we go. Yep, you've been owned. And if we look on the attacker system, we should see a shell come in. So there we go. That's a root shell. So that's a brief overview. Attacker sends in a maliciously crafted email. If the administrator checks his audit logs and that email comes up in the logs, he pulls in some additional JavaScript from the attacker system, does this spoofed file upload, runs this new function that we've added, which then sends a reverse shell back out to the attacker system on port 25. So that's rather ironic as well. We've got a root shell via a malicious email in an email filtering product. So obviously Symantec took this seriously and addressed the issues. They've got a good solid process, and so I reported this to them in April last year, and they fixed it in August. The other good thing they do is put quite good information about the vulnerability on their website and put ratings for how severe they think the issues are, and publish CVEs for each of the issues that I reported. So have a look at Trend Micro. So it's a very similar product from a similar vendor and similar issues really. So we had out-of-band cross-site scripting again, this time in the user portal. Cross-site request forgery, reflective and stored cross-site scripting, and we've got this root shell via patch upload feature, which is again authenticated, but we can combine that with some of the other attacks. So just quickly, we're going to look at attack against end users, because the cross-site scripting was an attack in the end user portal. So here's the product. So the end user portal is for users to go in and manage their spam. So if a spam's incorrectly quarantined, it's a real message they want to release, they can go in and release the message. So here we log in. This product also had password autocomplete on in this UI. So by using the cross-site script in this attack, you could actually gain access to their password by using the password autocomplete. If I just zoom in a bit on that, you can see that I've done a pop-up just to demonstrate the fact that the attacker's JavaScript has access to the plain text user password there. And these type of attacks, where you've got cross-site scripting and password autocomplete together, work on latest browsers. So here I'm using the latest version of Firefox. I tend to do most of my proof of concepts on Firefox because most things just work, like reflective cross-site scripting, that kind of stuff. But talking to my colleagues, these kind of attacks work on IE10 and Chrome 25, I think it is the latest version. So it's still relevant. So the solution to that is for the vendor to not enable password autocomplete. So the way that works, attacker sends in or spams in some messages to end users, kind of encouraging them to view that within the UI of the product, and then the end users, unbeknownst to them, send out their passwords to the attacker. So you could collect end user passwords en masse via an email attack. So this product also had, as I said, the root shell via file upload issue in the administrative UI. So a little bit more of a stretch, this one, but if the administrator also receives spam, you've got two UIs basically, so you could do cross-site request forgery between the two UIs. So if the administrator's logged in at the same time he's checking his user portal, you could launch an attack against the admin UI and then get a root shell that way. So a few more caveats with that one, but it's still potential there for that kind of attack. So that kind of goes like that. So here's a bit of a difference here. I've reported this to, so these two products are looked at in the same week, back in April 2012. Similar products from similar vendors. One's addressed the issues, another one hasn't. And we're almost a year beyond that point now. So I don't want to talk too much about this particular vendor, but there's quite a disparity between different vendors in terms of how they address these issues. And some of the vendors I've dealt with have been very good. So I'll talk more about those because I think it's important for vendors to copy the vendors that are doing this vulnerability mitigation process well. And the ones where I've had good experiences, WebSense, Symantec, McAfee, Citrix and Sophos were quite good as well. The typical fixed time tends to be about 4 or 5 months, that kind of thing. So it's longer than I would like it to be. But generally speaking, most vendors do address the issues. And it's important to be able to push out the information to the end customers as well, but only few vendors get that part right. So it's kind of an area to focus on, really. So more recently, I've been doing some other bits and pieces of research, poking about in some of the appliances a little bit deeper, looking at things like protections for memory corruption, that kind of stuff. So here again, looking at the trend appliance, a little bit difficult to see on that screen. I've got a zoom in there. So here, looking at the kernel protections, and you can see that there's some of the useful things that could be there for mitigating memory corruption issues are disabled. Looking at the compiled binaries, again, you can see we're missing stack canaries and pi, which can help protect for ASLR. And if you look at the functions themselves, you can see they're containing things like strcpy, strcat, scanf, things that Microsoft would term banned functions, because we know for many years there have been lots of vulnerabilities which have been caused by these kinds of function use, incorrect use of these functions. So what are the solutions? Well, if I stood up here and gave you a talk about what the solutions are, you'd be pretty bored, because we all know what the solutions are. Regular software maintenance, so a lot of these products are not having regular maintenance of the underlying operating system, so you've got vulnerable packages and old kernels, that kind of stuff. Secure development lifecycle, especially the custom binaries, and especially the web UI, which we all know is a real area where lots of things can go wrong. Product security testing, kind of goes without saying. Penetration testing can help pick up some of these things after the fact. So we've got lots of appliances out there which have got these vulnerabilities. Do we need to panic and freak out? Well, I say no. We just need to keep calm and carry on. In other words, we just need to do the things that we know we need to do. So my final conclusions. Well, my conclusions are that we've got a lot of vulnerable appliances out there. I would say about 80 to 90% of the appliances that I've looked at have got these kinds of issues. So that's an interesting state to be in 2012, 2013, isn't it? I talked a little about the variable responses from vendors. So had some vendors fix things quite quickly and communicate well, and other vendors obviously needs to be some work in that area. I can't really differentiate products based on the vulnerabilities that are there, because as I said, most of the products I looked at have got these kinds of issues. But I can only really differentiate vendors based on, whether they address the issues, how quickly they do it, and how they communicate to their customer base and, the person that's reporting the issues. The other thing I want to talk about is the evolution of products. So over the last 10 years, we've moved, especially in the solutions which are things like email filtering, we've moved from software products where originally the company that's deploying the product, they would install an operating system and a database, and then they'd install the product on top of that. And you can have all kinds of issues with the management of that software because the end customer's got to patch the operating system, patch the database, and you've got interoperability issues and all that kind of stuff. So we moved more towards appliances, where the software vendor is providing the appliance, it's all integrated, it all works nicely together, and the management of the database and the operating system is done by the vendor. But what I'm seeing is that that maintenance is not happening. The other thing that happened when we moved from software products to the appliances is that if there were any exploits, they become more reliable because of basically the appliances that are out there are effectively clones, because they've all got exactly the same operating system, exactly the same database for that particular brand of appliance. We've also moved from hardware appliances to virtual appliances. So lots of companies deploying virtual environments, they want the flexibility and all the good stuff that comes with that. And so lots of these vendors are deploying their hardware appliance and just basically taking that software, it's exactly the same piece of software, but deploying it in a virtual format. Now, that makes it much easier for attackers to evaluate the product. As I do, I basically go onto the vendor's website, download the product, talk to sales, get an evaluation license, and stick it on my ESX box, and I can have a poke about with it. So it makes the evaluation process easier, but it also makes the evaluation for attackers a bit easier. And the other thing I want to talk about is cloud services. So more recently, we're moving towards cloud services. Now, some vendors that provide these appliances also provide cloud services. Now, in other words, a kind of managed service version of email filtering or whatever. And sometimes those things are two completely different things. They're different technologies which have been perhaps acquired at different times from different other vendors. But sometimes they're the same thing. So in other words, they're exactly the same product, perhaps wrapped up with some management infrastructure. And sometimes where you've got third parties providing these managed services, they're just effectively using the off-the-shelf product and running it as a virtual appliance and then selling on that service to their customers. So what I'm basically saying is that some of these vulnerabilities apply to not just the appliances, the virtual appliances, but also to these cloud-based services, because it's effectively the same kind of software. Final little thought about Huawei. So there was a bit of fuss last year about Huawei. The implication being that Huawei had, or certain governments had, infiltrated Huawei, and that vulnerabilities have been deliberately introduced. Let's call it that. Now, when I heard that, I was a bit bemused. I mean, that might be true. I don't know. But I thought to myself, well, why do you need to code in extra vulnerabilities? Surely if you want to compromise these systems, you just look for the vulnerabilities that are there and exploit those. And when those get found and fixed by the vendor, you just look a bit harder and find some more. I don't think any government needs to try and add more. And that's it. So, got a little bit of time for questions, or I can show you one other thing. Any questions? Shall I show you one other thing quickly? This is a product that you might be familiar with. It's quite widely used in the security community. pfSense. But it's not secure by default. So you notice a couple of things here. HTTP by default, not HTTPS. And when you log in, you've got the browser autocomplete pop up. And as the product also had cross-site scripting, you could use this password theft attack. But here's something a bit crazy. Command injection is not always that difficult to find, because in this function, which is in there by default, which says use at your own risk, you've got root shell functionality in a web UI. Now, to me, that's a bit crazy. So you can execute commands as root, download files as root, upload files as root, execute PHP, and in this other function, you can basically edit files as root. Now, I use this product myself. I play about with it, but I would say, these kinds of open source products might need a bit of customization before you deploy them live. I would definitely, because it's an open product and you can reconfigure it and you can edit it in arbitrary ways, I would definitely go in and strip out some of these functions and change some of the defaults before you'd use it. Any questions at all? Go ahead.
If you look at the mobile device type of security appliance,
mobile devices.
No. The security appliance targeted to mobile device management?
No. I'm trying to think. Andy, we did look at some mobile device management issues. I don't know if Andy's around. Yeah, okay. Yes. I would say non-security products are worse than security products. So in non-security products, you tend to find things like SQL injection, stuff like that. You definitely find less of that in security products, because people in those environments where they're developing security products, they've been trained to use mitigations against SQL injection. I would say, yes, non-security products or security products that haven't got the security label tend to be slightly worse, but not so much worse than some of the things you've seen. Another question there?
Yeah, you talked about mitigation measures, and you talked primarily about what the vendors could do.
Yeah, sure.
As you illustrated, vendors might move in 3, 6, or a month, or even never.
Sure.
So as a person running these appliances, I have them in my network now. Judging from your talk, I have to assume they're all vulnerable. What can I do?
So the first and most important thing is do not expose the UI to the internet and SSH to the internet. Now, I've had this discussion with one of our customers, actually. So we did a pen test. We found that there was an admin UI for a security product exposed to the internet. And my recommendation was that they disable that or filter it. It was actually a gateway product which had SSL, it had VPN capability within it. So you could have set it up so that you could VPN in and manage the product. But they decided not to remove the web UI from the internet because it was a remote site and they were using the web UI to manage the product remotely. I would definitely say, if that's the case and it's a remote site, you should be using a VPN and then use, the web UI over the VPN. So that's the first thing. Don't expose these things to the internet. Secondly, if you're in secure environments, you might want to consider using a different browser for managing your internal products to the one you use to browse the internet. So enabling additional features within your browser, such as plugins. So for example, Firefox, you can use the NoScript plugin, which has got defenses against cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, and that kind of stuff. So have that on and properly configured so it's working, those kind of things. And locking these interfaces down. So where you've got SSH and web UIs, lock them down so that only IP addresses within a management, like a NOC, or certain management subnet can access those systems directly, not just any internal user. Because sometimes these attacks, if they're unauthenticated attacks against the web UI, you can do them reflectively from any internal user, not just the administrator. Yeah. So those are briefly my advice. Any other questions? Thank you very much for listening.